Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the first Cyber Ed webinar series call that we're having here, brought to you by Rocus Networks. Today's talk is on the Great 8, Cybersecurity Essentials for Every Business. So we're really happy to bring you this first part in what will ultimately be a series of educational-based webcasts that are going to help you learn a little bit more about your business and what cybersecurity essentials are important for your success. We're really happy today to be joined by Mike Viruso. Mike is the Chief Strategy Officer at Rocus Networks. Mike has over 20 years of experience in the technology space. Before joining Rocus, he was very instrumental in the success and upstarts of both Palo Alto Networks as well as Cylance. So we're really happy to have his expertise and be able to share some of his skill sets and opinions with you. And when I was bringing up these slides and we were going over this presentation, I looked at this very first slide and I got a little bit spooked. I look at these recent breaches that we're going to start today's webinar with, and I'm a Marriott Rewards member. I have a Dell computer. I have a letter at home on our dining room table from Atrium Health describing the AccuDoc breach. And of course, like many of you probably, I am a DD Perks card carrying member. So Mike, when we look at some of these recent breaches, and of course, this is not to pick on anybody in particular, these are just things that are every day and have happened recently. What do we know about what's happened here and kind of what's going on?
Thanks, Chris. Well, you can't have a cybersecurity presentation without showing breaches, I guess, right? But really, this isn't to, like you said, to beat up anybody. It's really to just bring awareness. And I thought these were very pertinent breaches only because, one, they're recent. Two is there's lessons to be learned in any breach that occurs, and there's some good lessons here. And I'll touch on them during the presentation, but to just maybe point out some things, if you look at like the Dunkin' Donuts and the Dell breach, they were very much password related. That's mainly what the adversaries gained in these attacks. And there's some education and awareness around that, around password management and the utilization of passwords that I'll touch on. The Marriott breach to me is extremely interesting because it touches on a lot of things that we should be aware of that's going on in the cybersecurity world. Couple things. One is if you read anything about this, the dwell time or the time to detection on the Marriott breach was roughly about 4 years. So as I get into this presentation, I'll talk a lot about prevention and tools to be utilized and controls that should be put in place. But 4 years is a very long time to detect a breach. The other thing we learned from this is it was really Starwood that was compromised and their data. There's a lot around folks who have a lot of conversations, but it's not always done around due diligence during mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of times the IT organization or the cybersecurity department of any organization is pulled in after the acquisition's made, not necessarily during the due diligence phase. So a lot can be learned there. The other piece of this was the way the adversaries were able to compromise the data is if you read a little bit about it, they made a copy of the data, encrypted it, and most likely exfiltrated that data over an encrypted channel. So there's some lessons to be learned there that I'll touch on during the presentation. The final one, which is the Atrium Health breach, is extremely interesting. And, I don't know the audience that's on the call, but if there's folks who are on the call who are small and medium organizations, you may not be as familiar with AccuDoc, but AccuDoc is one of their third-party vendors. They're probably about 150 company headquartered in Morrisville, North Carolina, and they were doing the majority of the billing management for Atrium Health. So Atrium Health was not compromised by any means. It was their third-party vendor. So 2 lessons here about third-party due diligence. And secondly, that everybody's a target. I have these conversations on a daily basis with a lot of smaller organizations who may not necessarily believe they are a target, but I always ask the question and ask smaller business owners and IT staff to really ask I ask them who they do business with. A lot of times you are a launch pad to somebody you do business with, a larger organization, or the data that you are holding for organizations you do business with. So a lot to be learned there. 2.6 million patient records have been compromised. They're saying this could be the largest healthcare breach to date. So anyway, let's move on, Chris. Enough about breaches.
Yeah, sure. Well, we also have to kind of talk a little bit about the why. Why is cybersecurity so important? Why is it important to know these 8 essentials that we have for small and medium-sized businesses? So why don't we kind of get to the why behind the reason this is so important?
Sure, Chris. So, kind of say we all live in a bad neighborhood, but the cyber world is dangerous. There is no place that is safe. We all hope that we live in safe neighborhoods and our neighborhoods are protected, but the cyber world is completely different. There is no safeness out there. We, like I say, unlike a lot of times we look at detection, and a lot of these breaches that I mentioned earlier talk about after the fact. And I really believe that prevention needs to be the focus in security, and I'll talk a lot about that during this presentation and this webinar. I think the cybersecurity community has done a poor job, and I guess I have to say I'm part of that, so I'm guilty as charged. But we've made people believe that preventing an attack is not possible. We use a lot of terms out there, and you can see them if you're browsing the internet, of it's not if but when, or attacks are very sophisticated in nature, which makes you almost believe that it's impossible to really prevent attacks. But I kind of take a stance that that's very far from the truth, right? And I'll talk a lot about that. Also, that the thing is, it affects everyone, right? Regardless, it's both personal, it's business wise. It doesn't matter the size of your business. We can no longer say, well, I'm too small to be a target. I think today we're very close. It's kind of like the 3 degrees of separation. I think it's even closer than that we've either had an incident ourselves or we know somebody who has. And finally, the consequences are too high, right? It's just, if something was to happen, when we look at the cost of breaches and the consequences, and then you put reputational damage on top of that, it's hard to not focus on this, right? And kind of the little depiction here of outrunning the bear, or you don't need to outrun the bear, just the person next to you. The problem is there's not just one bear chasing you anymore. There's more bears than the people you're running with. So it's very hard to outrun the bear these days.
And that's an excellent point, Mike. And I think that the outrunning the bear is certainly one of those things here, right? We're all, the bear's out there. You got to have a good pair of running shoes. You got to be able to do that, but it's not all about that. We do have to look at a little bit about what we're doing as an industry and what we could be doing better in terms of sort of changing that mentality. This next slide here, though, kind of talks. Really the focus of it is that continuous monitoring and analytics that's so important through this. Can you kind of go through this chart here and tell us a little bit about what it says about the overall cybersecurity picture?
Sure. The reason I put this here is because, first of all, I just want to let the audience know this is not a technology pitch today. We're not talking about specific products. We're talking about security controls that you can put into your environment. There's thousands of technology solutions out there that can address these 8 essentials that I'll be talking about. What's most important to understand is that nothing in security is a set and forget proposition, right? Security is a program that requires, as I would say, continuous improvement utilizing technology, people, and process. You can buy the latest and greatest technology all day long, but if you cannot operationalize it and manage it effectively, it becomes essentially worthless, right? So what this is to show is that we need to continuously improve what's going on in our organization. any controls we put in place, we have to find ways to improve it, to operationalize that, and that really takes both good technology coupled with very good people who can manage that technology effectively. So that's an important aspect of this presentation, that it isn't all about technology. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's go over those two so you can kind of get into the meat of today's webcast on these 8 essentials. So we've got vulnerability risk management, employee awareness and training, email security controls, network security controls, application and user ID controls, SSL inspection, advanced endpoint controls, and security monitoring with threat detection and response. And so what we want to do is kind of, Mike, if you would, just kind of walk us through and open up this very first area, which is on the vulnerability and the risk management, or maybe just overall address these initial 8 that are on the list here today.
Yeah, I think what I want to just let the audience know is that, first of all, there's people out there who are probably even smarter than me, but this is not everything in security, right? How I look at it is, what's most important to one organization is not necessarily of the same importance level to another organization. For instance, an online retailer would obviously have different concerns about the type of attacks that can come into their organization than, let's say, an accounting firm that just has an informational website, right? So an online retailer is definitely going to be concerned very much about attacks to that web application. They may deploy things like web application firewalls and even like DDoS protection, where an accounting firm that really doesn't have a monetary presence on the internet and makes money over their internet site is not really going to be concerned about those things, but they're definitely going to be concerned about protecting data and protecting their clients' data. So where I really focused on these 8 essentials is more of the latter, to focus more on what I would call the data protection of network security and the business related aspects of that, as opposed to maybe a web-facing organization, right? Even web-facing organizations have internal security and network security that they need to be concerned about, and that's where the focus is. One thing I'll mention about all of this, it's not, those controls or those 8 essentials are not necessarily set up in a building block approach. There is some order to it, but for instance, what I would say is number 8, which is detection and respond and monitoring. If doing just number 8 and not doing 1 through 7 is not necessarily a good strategy. So, and I'll touch on that. So going into this, I like to put this out there. You're going to hear me say prevention a lot. You're going to hear me say it probably multiple times today. I probably said it 3 or 4 or 5 times. And I don't stand alone in my stance on focusing in on prevention, but I am surely I would say a minority in the industry. A good friend of mine and a well-respected individual, Malcolm Harkins, who is he's the Chief Information Security Officer at Cylance, and formerly he was the Chief Security and Privacy Officer at Intel. And he's written numerous books, but he put this 9-box controls model together. And if you look at it, and many folks who might be on the line might be familiar with the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, you are ultimately trying to be in the upper right-hand quadrant. This is kind of a reverse model. Where you really want to be is in the lower left-hand part of the quadrant, and you want to be in that automated prevention stage, right? And the reason behind that is if you're in that stage, the risk is lower, as well as the cost. Doing prevention is a tremendous amount less than trying to do detection and response in a manual process. That takes human capital. It also incurs dwell time if something is missed. So it can result, obviously, in higher damages if something was to happen. The other piece of this that is very important is that the reason why prevention has gotten a bad name or a bad rap, I think, in the industry is because a lot of preventative tools out there cause a tremendous amount of friction. And what I mean by friction in the security world is basically slowing down the business, right? There's a fine line with actually providing security and then trying to operationalize and do business on a daily basis, right? So the term that I like to use is ultimately to safely enable the business, right? So security should not be an inhibitor. It should be the underlying fabric that allows the business to move forward without inhibiting it at all, okay? So that's a little bit about this 9-box control. Again, focusing on prevention, and not saying detection and response is not a strategy and should not be part of your ultimate strategy, but it's not the only strategy.
Okay, Mike, well, let's take a look at the first one here, which addresses specifically that vulnerability and that vulnerability risk management. I think this is probably a good spot to start. Obviously, risk can have a bunch of different variables associated with, and just to kind of understand what it means in terms of security and the vulnerabilities that exist out there. So why don't we touch on some of the things that you have here on the screen?
Thanks, Chris. So we're moving into number one, which is vulnerability risk management. So to start off, there's many risk formulas out there, but essentially the way to look at risk, I try to look at it as in this simple formula of threats times vulnerabilities times consequences. It is a multiplication formula, so I kind of like to put it out there that if you're able to get any one of these variables down to zero, then you will ultimately eliminate risk. Unfortunately, we can't do that in cybersecurity, but what we can do is try to get as close to zero as possible. The one area here that we really have very little influence on to change are threats. We can't change the threat landscape. We can't change what adversaries are doing. What we can do is understand it. We can understand the current threats and the threats that are out there and how bad actors are exploiting vulnerabilities to get a foothold into environments, but there's nothing we can do about it. Where we really can focus, and where I'm going to focus mostly today, is around vulnerabilities. A vulnerability is not necessarily a vulnerability that just lies in software. To me, a vulnerability is any weakness that can be compromised. So whether that's an unpatched system or a gap in your security posture or the controls that are in place today, that is a vulnerability that can be exposed. So what I always like to say when you're doing security, before you do anything, right, you have to answer a couple key questions, right? So question number one is, what do you need to protect? And this kind of gets into consequences, right? And this is going to be a different answer for different businesses, right? I always ask the question to most organizations when we're doing kind of risk assessments is what are the family jewels to the organization? What would have the greatest impact to the business if it was compromised, right? So for example, that is going to be a different answer for, let's say, a wealth advisor, right, who is handling sensitive data of all of their clients, right? So I would say an ultimate compromise or doomsday scenario for a wealth advisor is going to be that data being stolen or getting in the wrong hands. A manufacturing facility or manufacturing organization is going to have a different type of appetite for risk and a different consequence that would ultimately, result in a negative impact to their business. So if somebody was to come in and somehow shut down their manufacturing line for a day or two, that would be a tremendous impact to their bottom line, right? The other question to ask is, where is that information? Or where is that process? Or where does it exist, right? We have to understand what it is and then where it is. And then finally, we have to ask the last two questions, or two more questions, is who has access to it, right? And how do they have access to it, right? And then finally, where we get into the vulnerabilities is once we understand all of that. So if I know I have sensitive data that's sitting in a cloud environment, and I have given access to all of my employees, and they can access that information somehow, some way, from their computer in the office, outside the office, and maybe I even gave access to contractors and third parties to that information, then I can start answering the question of where are the vulnerabilities that could be compromised, right, to access that data. So I always say you have to understand where the data is, where the gaps are before you can even move into actually protecting it. So this is a very, very important aspect of cybersecurity.
Well, great. And I think that really makes a lot of sense, Mike. Let's take a look at this employee part too, because I know, and from talking to you offline here, that this is a big deal. And I can tell you that I remember years ago when I was working at a rather large company, I had to go through, I don't know, maybe a 5-minute, 5-question, don't pick up a thumb drive in the parking lot and put it in your computer, and don't leave your computer unlocked. And that was about the end of it. And if I answered those 5 questions, off I went. But it seems like it's much more than that, right? That maybe there needs to be a lot more as far as the employee awareness and training in and around cybersecurity. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, Chris. People still pick up the thumb drives, by the way, so it's still effective. But really, and I'm not going to read through every single one of these. What's most important is for folks to know that people are a security control, right? They actually can be very effective if trained appropriately, but they're also one of your biggest security risks, right? So very interesting, right, that they can actually act as a benefit to the organization because they are a lot of times your first line of defense. But they also are a very high security risk because they do make mistakes. We all do. I make mistakes. We do simulated phishing attacks in our organization, and I have been susceptible, and they're very good ones. So everybody makes mistakes. The biggest thing I think that organizations can do is really try to create a culture around security. And what I mean by this is we need to allow employees in our organizations to feel that they can speak up freely without embarrassment, right? We need them to be able to, when they see something of concern, to not feel shamed or feel inferior sometimes to the IT organization or anybody in the organization to say, I may have clicked on something bad, right? There's a lot of times that an employee may actually click on something. It does not get detected in the organization. The employee does not say anything, and that is where the harm lies, right? It would be better if an employee was to click on something, maybe something out of the ordinary just didn't seem right, and to actually raise their hand and speak up to someone in the organization and say that I may have a concern. So then it can go ahead and be researched and to find if it actually was malicious. The other thing we just have to understand that I think as employees in our organizations is one that, any of the things we use, whether that's a corporate computer that is given to us, right, or the email that we're utilizing inside of our organizations, we need to understand that that is corporate property, right, and that we need to have a separation between what's corporate property and what's our personal property, right? I know it's very convenient to use the same email address for everything in your life, but I think we should take more concern, and at this point in time, we should really start separating those things and not be giving out our corporate email addresses for personal reasons. And then, finally is just being aware that, things like we've all heard of the CEO spoofing emails where a CEO sends something to account, or there's an email that comes in for a wire transfer or something like that. We just need to be cognizant of that. We've gotten away from, I think, phone communication in this day and age now. And I always go back to and say, why would anybody wire somebody 20, 30, 50, $100,000 without picking up a telephone and making sure that that is legitimate, right? So it's just really using common sense in many aspects of this.
All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the third essential here, which specifically relates to email security. And email is in all of our lives. I think that we kind of have, some filters and some things that kind of help. We got a folder for spam. Is that really enough, though? What else could we be doing? And why is email security control such an important part for a small and medium-sized business, Mike?
Well, email security is important for any business. One, it affects the entire company. Just about everybody's on email. Some organizations have more email users than actual employees because they might have third parties and contractors that are in their on their email domain. But the deal is just about every attack starts with a phishing type of attack over email. Last year, they said that 90% of the successful attacks started with a phishing email. Here's the thing. In any phase of an attack, most of the times the attacker is trying to get something delivered into the organization, then to potentially have something execute on a machine or somebody to put in credential information or something. And in order to do that, in many aspects, they need somebody to fall prey to that. So when we talk with many organizations, and when you look at, and we're getting into now, the technology pieces of security and the controls, email, like I said, is, if you look at cybersecurity, a lot of people incorporate what's considered a defense in depth strategy, and with that's kind of a military term, but what it really means is you put multiple layers of security controls in place, assuming that one layer may fail and there's another layer to actually prevent an attack. A lot of times email is that first layer. It's where a lot of attacks start, as I said. It also takes a burden off of a lot of your employees. You may have a very good training and awareness program, but having some type of email security that's actually looking for malicious URLs and malicious malware that's trying to be delivered, and even looking inside embedded documents for embedded URL activity or embedded malicious URLs, etc., can really take the burden off of your employees and relying on them to identify what might or may not be malicious. So this is definitely a major and essential security control that needs to be put in every organization.
Well, great. And I think, kind of right in line there, I know networks and what we know about networks and where networks are in this day and age, even compared to as little as 5 or 10 years ago, is quite different. You touched on some of that earlier with some of the cloud work. What do we need to know as far as network security controls go, and where networks are in today's world?
Yeah, well, network security is essential to any business, and a lot of businesses do have some form of network security in place. The problem is the way our networks are today look nothing like they were 5-10 years ago. 5-10 years ago, not many people were mobile as much as they are today. It was easier to protect our data networks because we may have had a single network that was very closed. A lot of our employees reported to an office. Computers maybe never left the building. And we were able to put some very good network security controls in place, like firewalls and IPS and IDS and sandboxing technologies, etc. The problem is the network is everywhere today. Our networks we have on-premise networks. Our networks are now in the cloud. They're in providers like AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, and unfortunately, a lot of folks have a false sense of security, for no pun intended, that by putting maybe a lot of their network infrastructure in an AWS environment or an Azure environment means that it is secure. I would urge anybody on the webinar to read your shared responsibility model language with any one of those providers, and it will clearly state that it is your duty to protect your infrastructure. It is not the cloud provider's duty to do that. And so whether our networks are in the cloud or on premise or at a colo facility or what have you, it is still our responsibility to protect it, as if it was 10 years ago where we had a single location and everybody was in one building. The other thing is a lot of times we do a very good job at protecting our outer part of the network, which is really the web-facing side of it or our internet connection, and we put controls in place like firewalls and et cetera. But where we fail to actually put security controls in place is on our internal networks, right? We don't have much visibility or control on what is actually happening there. So we have kind of this very, what I would say, secure outer edge of our networks. But once we're internal, we're almost trusted in the environment. And if an attacker is to get in, then they're almost trusted as well and can get to really any sensitive information that they're looking for. So we need to actually look at providing both what I would call network controls on the outer edge as well as internal. And then the other piece of this is eliminating point solutions when we get into network security. The industry has evolved tremendously. The technology has evolved tremendously. There are next generation firewalls and unified threat management platforms that have brought many disparate technologies into a single platform, which provides tremendous context across various controls that are protecting your network security, and it reduces expense, right? And obviously reduces risk at the same time. As we move on, as we get into 5 and 6, Chris, just so you know, there's some security network. A lot of these are network security related, but I've put them in their own place for various reasons.
Yeah, and that is pretty scary, Mike, especially when you think about the fact that some of the walls that we have we do forget about what might be inside there, and how important it is to look inwardly as well. Now, number 5 on your list here of essentials is the application and user ID controls. The control of perhaps the way I would look at something like this would be, as an employee, can I get on Facebook? Can I catch up on Netflix and things like that? Is that what we're talking about here? I mean, it seems like some companies, they have no problem with people accessing certain sites, obviously not forbidden sites and things like that. But is this just more about employees not wasting company time, or does it go beyond that?
Well, we sure don't want employees wasting companies' time, and sometimes it can be a little bit of that, but it's more about reducing the attack surface and how the threat landscape has changed, right? So, back in time, we basically used 2 applications for the most part over our networks. We used web browsing and we used email, and it was very easy to kind of lock things down. With the emergence of Web 2.0 and SaaS applications and those being essential to businesses. Businesses today, every business today is using some form of SaaS application. Some businesses run their entire organization over SaaS applications, right? So attackers know that too. So now they're able to exploit applications rather than targeting the operating systems as much. So what we need to have out there, and again, I mentioned earlier that a lot of these, or I might have mentioned that a lot of these technologies, especially getting to application and user controls, are inherent in a lot of the new type firewalls and unified threat management platforms that are out there. The problem is that many organizations have not deployed them. I can prove that in many organizations we've walked into and had conversations about the new types of technologies they've deployed, but unfortunately they may have migrated the old rule bases of legacy type firewalls, et cetera, and just migrated that over to the new technology. Why is this? Well, sometimes it can be lack of expertise. It could be lack of time, kind of I'll get to it later. We need to do a migration. We need to get the business running, and I'll get to it later. And we never do get to it. But it is essential that organizations are building policies inside their environment around applications and tying that back to the users in their organization.
Yeah, well, Mike, listen, we had a question come in. I just want to kind of throw it out there. Could you explain a little bit more about that acronym SaaS, what a SaaS technology looks like, and essentially what that means?
Oh, okay. So SaaS, software as a service. So things like Salesforce is a great one out there because many organizations use it, right? Salesforce is a software as a service application. It's a sales management platform. It does many things, but that's essentially what it is. And Web 2.0 are basically applications that were developed right for business usage. So kind of goes hand in hand with SaaS, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. And thank you for your questions. If anybody does have questions as we move along here, feel free to go ahead and type them in the sidebar there. That's an excellent question, though. I mean, I think some of these terminologies and some of these new uses of these terminologies are something we also have to get our arms around as we go through here. Let's kind of move along here to our next essential application. This is SSL inspection. I think we look from an encryption standpoint that, I think that from a consumer standpoint, something's encrypted. Gosh, I feel safe all of a sudden. Doesn't really seem to be the case, though, right? It seems like in some of these situations, the encryption might be a false sense of security. Can you kind of touch on that? I mean, especially this rather ominous quote here that we started from Jason Brevenick in terms of what this means. What do we need to know about the encryption part of it, Mike?
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things. Encryption is the thing that protects us can also can be used against us, right? So what's very interesting is, and we look at, as an organization, what we do, we're seeing customers' environments all the time, and we are seeing that roughly about 70% of the web traffic in most customers' environments is encrypted. So it's running over SSL, which is a form of encryption. And that's not a bad thing that we're encrypting our data, right? Because by encrypting it, we're basically masking it, so adversaries can't see that data. The unfortunate part of that is that about 2/3 of malware attacks that occur over an SSL encrypted channel. So the same type of channel that is encrypted, adversaries are using to basically mask their efforts, right? So if that is occurring and we are not doing something to actually decrypt that traffic and inspect it for threats, we are leaving a gaping hole in our entire security posture, right? So I always say you can have the best security on the planet. You can have the best network security out there, right? But if 70% of your traffic is invisible, right, you can't protect it. So why do we see a lot of organizations not deploy encryption tech or decryption technologies? Various reasons, but the number one reason is that the good news is many technologies that people have deployed have the ability to do decryption. The bad news is that when you turn decryption on in many technologies, it actually can sometimes hinder the performance tremendously. And because of that, this gets into that kind of that conversation around friction. It can cause a tremendous amount of friction. So organizations choose not to do it. Many of the technologies that they deployed, i.e., firewall technology that might have this type of function embedded in it, have not been sized correctly to actually handle the load when this is turned on. So it's very important for organizations as they review their technology stacks and the infrastructure they've deployed, that they start asking their vendors questions around if I do decryption inside my organization, what type of or what model appliance or whatever it may be is needed if I want to do that.
Yeah, and I mean that's scary. To me, it feels like a little bit like having, an alarm system that you just haven't bothered turning on yet, right? That might detect some type of motion inside, and I think that's some pretty good advice too about in terms of maybe trying to contact people responsible for the technology just to see if that's something that could be utilized in your organization. And we come to another one here, number 7 on advanced endpoint protection and the controls associated with that. Just talking about just your traditional antivirus software. What do we know here? Why is this so important? Why would this be something that a small or medium-sized business, why would this be essential to their cybersecurity and protection, Mike?
Well, a lot of small and medium businesses out there have suffered ransomware attacks, and that's like the soup du jour these days, and it's rampant, and it's only growing. And the reason why they're so successful is really because of the statement that was made 4 years ago that you see here. And what's always interesting to me about this is even one of the leading antivirus vendors out there had said 4 years ago that antivirus is essentially dead. 9 out of 10 organizations that I talk with or speak or meet with are still using these legacy antivirus products. And when the rubber meets the road, ultimately in any scenario and most of attacks, an adversary is truly trying to get or compromise somebody's machine, somebody's computer, or a server in the environment. And sometimes that's where that can be even where the information is that they're trying to gather. And I kind of use the analogy of bringing a knife to a gunfight when a lot of folks are still using antivirus, and are not necessarily aware of some of the more advanced technologies that are out there. And I'm not going to get into a technical discussion around why antivirus may not be effective, but there are new technologies that use machine learning algorithms, and are very effective at not only blocking what I would consider known attacks, but also the unknown attacks, or what we would call in the security industry zero-day attacks. So I always tell folks that this is your last line of defense. It's sometimes your only line of defense. And the reason behind that is, just think of a user who's remote, is not connected to any of your network security controls. Maybe they're getting phished via their own personal email that doesn't have the protections that maybe you put into your environment for your corporate email. And essentially that endpoint protection that's sitting on that employee's computer is really their only line of defense to actually prevent an attack from occurring. So I just think a lot of diligence needs to be done here, and a lot of focus should be done here to really review what is being used today, and maybe reviewing some of these or looking into some of these newer technologies.
Mike, a question to come in. You had mentioned 0 days a couple of times. Can you just maybe quickly explain what you mean by that, and what it means to somebody in your business, and more importantly, what it would mean to one of the people that are attending the webcast here today?
Sure. So a 0 day, sometimes called an O day, essentially it's something that has never been seen before. Is the best way of saying it. So use in the essence, or in the example of malware, which is malicious software that gets into an environment and can do something malicious in nature. Ransomware is a perfect example. But a 0 day is something that nobody has seen or identified yet that it is malicious in nature. So, and this will give you a little insight. So the way traditional antivirus solutions work, they are signature-based technologies, and in order for the antivirus to be aware to actually block something in the environment, somebody has to have seen it before. So essentially, you need what's kind of referred to as the sacrificial lamb in security, but somebody has to have gotten hit by it. The AV industry needs to know that, and then they can write a signature to say that's bad and then block it. That's kind of like playing whack-a-mole these days, because today, statistics I've seen, and I've seen it all over, but there's close to 1 million different variants of malware or column 0 days on a daily basis, right? So it becomes extremely difficult for antivirus companies to write signatures fast enough to keep up with the number of attacks that are out there. So that's why utilizing certain types of technologies that use machine learning that don't necessarily rely on a signature, but more rely on understanding the DNA and the structure of files that are coming in that are malicious to actually make a determination are way more effective.
Well, I mean, that is just a scary number, and thank you for kind of giving some clarification around what those threats look like. And I know you said, Mike, in the beginning, as we looked at these 8 essentials for cybersecurity, that this may be one of the last lines here, this number 8, and how it related to the other 7 and so forth. So in this one, as we talked and touched on kind of in the beginning, the monitoring of the security mechanisms and posture that you have in place is really paramount importance. Can you kind of get into a little bit about this 24/7, 365 monitoring and why it's so important?
Sure. Yeah, I do focus a lot on prevention, and I believe prevention is key, and it should be the primary focus for any security program within an organization. But it does not mean that there is a silver bullet and that prevention will be 100% possible. I think you can get very close to 100%, but having somebody monitoring, whether that's somebody internal to the organization or hiring an outside firm to do this, is definitely an essential tenet to cybersecurity. You have to almost make the assumption that all else can fail, and we need to actually detect and respond to something as quickly as possible. In the world of security, and you read, unfortunately, the average dwell time or the time to detection today, I think in the latest reports, is somewhere around 201 days, which is staggering. That sometimes organizations do not detect that something malicious in nature has occurred for that long. So having somebody monitoring and more importantly, detecting and responding to what is seen in the infrastructure is essential. Now, I'll use the analogy, right? Many of us, I think probably everybody on the phone may have an alarm system in their house. And it's definitely great practice to have an alarm and turn it on at night and turn it on when you leave, but it doesn't replace the locks on your doors and windows. I don't think anybody would put an alarm system and say, well, now we can remove those. We still have to have preventative controls in place, even in our what I call my analog world or physical world. It's the same in the cybersecurity world. The other piece of it is if we're not doing prevention and all we do is focus on this detection and response side of the equation, we're putting a tremendous burden on the humans, right, and the people who are actually doing this type of activity. Those people are very expensive, number one, but they also are humans and get tired. And the more information you throw at them and inundate them with, right, the more apt they're to miss something. But if you can actually put very good preventative controls and continuously improve those preventative controls, and your security teams and your monitoring teams are not trying to look for the needle in the haystack anymore, right? They can be proactive in what they're doing. They can be looking for threats rather than reacting to numerous and millions of logs that come into the environment that they have to actually deal with on a daily basis. So it's definitely a key tenet, but it's definitely not a replacement for the other preventative controls.
Right, Mike, let's we're just Mike, we're just going to go ahead and kind of go over the review here. Also, again, if you have a question you'd like to ask Mike, please feel free to type it into the Q&A section, the sidebar on the right-hand side of your screen. Be happy to address those or get back to you after today's webcast. But again, just in review, we talked about vulnerability risk management, employee awareness and training, email security controls, network security controls, application user ID controls, the importance of SSL inspection and advanced endpoint controls, and then sort of lastly there, the 24/7, 365 monitoring and making sure that threat detection and response is in play. So let's take a look at some next steps here. Rocus Networks, you can find Mike, you can find his other associates and some of the things that they're able to do to help and assist. If you have any questions you'd like to ask offline, you can contact Mike directly at the email on your screen, also through any of the various social media platforms. To make sure and follow Rocus Networks. You can keep abreast of any new information that is out there for you, as well as additional webcasts in the future about some additional topics related to cybersecurity. So we'll stick around and see if any additional questions come in. Thank you for joining here today. Mike, thank you for your expertise and your information on today's call. Have a great rest of your day, everybody else, and we'll be sure and talk to you again real soon. Take care.